I'd like to talk now about international systems. Imagine that there were an exam in this course, and imagine that the examination question was the following. What war does the following quotation describe? And I'll read the question for you. After the last war, the international system developed two rigid camps. This bipolarity led to a loss of flexibility and a heightened insecurity. One of the new alliances developed around an authoritarian land-based power, the other around a democratic power with an expansive commerce and culture which held naval supremacy. Each side feared that the other would achieve a decisive advantage in the conflict that both expected. Ironically, it was a civil conflict in a small, weak state threatening a marginal change in the alliances that heightened the sense of threat in both alliances and actually triggered the war. Does that quote describe the Peloponnesian War, as described by Thucydides, World War I, or the Cold War, or all of the above? In any case, that's an example of a systems-type explanation, or a question based on that, and it's something that we therefore need to think about, which is what do we mean when we talk about international systems? And what are we explaining when we say that it's explained in terms of an international system? Well, what's a system, to start with it? Well, a system is a set of interrelated units. That's basically what the dictionary tells you. And when we look at a domestic political system, it's relatively easy to identify. There are clear institutional reference, the president, the Congress, Parliament, what have you. The international political system is more intangible. It's decentralized. Institutions aren't so crucial. Even without the United Nations, for example, there is still an international system. And nor is the international system just the states. The international political system is the pattern of relations among the states. Now, as a footnote, let me say you shouldn't be misled by the apparent concreteness of the domestic political system. It's not that simple. The domestic system includes a number of intangible aspects such as public attitudes, the role of the press, the unwritten conventions of the Constitution, and so forth. But the important point about systems of any sort is that the whole pattern is greater than the sum of the parts. The pattern can create consequences that are not intended by any of the actors in the system. For example, take the concept of the market system in economics. While each business firm in a perfect market system tries to maximize its profits, the market system produces competition that actually reduces profits to the break-even point and thereby benefits the consumer. It's not that the businessman sets out to benefit the consumer, but that the pattern of behavior in a perfect market system leads to that effect. And similarly, in the international political system, the system itself can create behavior that may not be the actor's original intention. For example, when the Bolsheviks came to power after the Russian Revolution in 1917, Leon Trotsky was appointed the Commissar for Foreign Affairs, charged with the Foreign Ministry, and he was asked, what are you going to do with the Foreign Ministry? Well, since Trotsky regarded interstate diplomacy as bourgeois nonsense, he said he would soon sweep away the interstate system and replace it with proletarian solidarity. And in that case, he said, I'll just issue some revolutionary proclamations to the peoples, and then I'll close up the joint. Well, it wasn't that simple, because the Soviets were part of an interstate system, and that affected their behavior. By 1922, they signed the Treaty of Rapallo with Germany, which has sometimes been called the Alliance of the Outcasts. And, of course, in 1939, Stalin signed the treaty with Hitler, which tried to turn Hitler to the West, which was, again, an odd alliance. So in that sense, the Soviet behavior fit very much with the traditions of the international system. Indeed, in an anarchic situation, where power is dispersed among a number of states, the international system will often allow one to predict states' behavior. And there's a long tradition of geopolitics, which location is power, and a key factor is proximity. And the question is, are you feeling threatened by your neighbor? And you try to balance the power of your neighbor to make sure you feel safe. More than 3 centuries before Christ, the Indian writer Kautilya pointed out that states will tend to make alliances with their more distant states in order to protect themselves against their neighbors. Or there's an old saying in the Middle East, and other regions as well, that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, what that does, if you have that type of behavior, is it produces a checkerboard pattern of alliances. And it was fascinating in the early 1960s, for example, as a score of new states became independent in North and West Africa and proclaimed Pan-African solidarity, to find them very rapidly developing this checkerboard pattern of alliances. Something that would have been quite similar to Kautilya's India or Machiavelli's Italy. Ghana, Guinea, and Mali created a loose alliance against Senegal, Ivory Coast, and Nigeria. And what was interesting was it formed something of a checkerboard. Or if you take the situation of East Asia, in the last 20 years, it's quite interesting. Look at East Asia today, and what do you see among the 4 communist governments there? The Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, Cambodia. Well, if you colored one red and the next black, you'd get the checkerboard. Red, black, red, black. Essentially, they're all communist states, but they're allied not with each other, but with the next state over, in terms of the alliance patterns. And the great irony of this, of course, is that in the Vietnam War, the Americans thought that they were playing dominoes, that if one toppled, they'd all topple, a big red chain. If we'd understood that the game was checkers, we might have done a lot better. In any case, what we see then is a situation in which we can make certain predictions in international politics that help us to get some control on things. Now, these examples raise a larger question of what's a good explanation in international politics. Kenneth Waltz, a political scientist at the University of California in Berkeley, wrote a book called Man, the State, and War, in which he said that explanations of what happens in international politics tend to come in 3 flavors, if you want, or 3 levels. He called them 3 images. One is the explanation on the basis of individuals. Second is the explanation on the basis of the state, the type of country it is. And the third is explanation according to the type of system that it is. Now, the first level, or image in Waltz's terms, is the individual. And he argues that it rarely provides a good explanation. And the reason that explaining international politics in terms of individuals is rarely a good explanation is that it reduces international politics to the action of individuals. But as I argued earlier, the very nature of international politics is politics among anarchically organized states, not individuals. So we have seen that, that too much emphasis on intentions, the intentions of individuals, may misplace or mislead in the sense that it doesn't take sufficient account of the unintended effects which come from the effects of system. Now, this isn't to argue that individuals don't matter, or they don't matter at all. Clearly they do. For example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, Kennedy and Khrushchev had the capacity to press the button, so to speak, and to launch a nuclear war which could have been a tremendous disaster. And the ultimate decision rested with those individuals. So in that sense, clearly the individuals mattered. But why Kennedy and Khrushchev found themselves in that incredible position can't be explained in terms of individuals. Similarly, knowing something about the personality of Kaiser Wilhelm or of Adolf Hitler is important to understanding the causes of World War I and World War II, as we'll see in a few lectures from now. But it is not a sufficient explanation. It may have been good British propaganda to have blamed World War I on the Kaiser, but it's not good analysis. Now, if we ask the broader questions of international politics, such as why do states go to war, then the inadequacy of explanation at the level of individuals becomes clearer. Suppose we say that the reason that states go to war is because human beings are basically evil at heart, or there's something deep in humans, deep in the individual, that is the cause. But that doesn't explain why some evil leaders go to war and some evil leaders don't go to war, or why some good leaders go to war and some good leaders don't go to war. So in that sense, image number one, the picture of the world in terms of individuals, can't give you very good answers. We say that a theory like that over-predicts. It explains some things correctly, but so does a stop clock. Twice a day, get the time right. By reducing international politics to the level of individuals, these types of explanations explain too much and thus explain too little at the same time. Waltz also argues that similar problems plague efforts to explain international politics in terms of image two, which is explanations in terms of what kind of a country it is. If certain types of society cause war, then why do some bad states not go to war and some good states do go to war? And then insert your preferred type of state for good or bad. For example, if you say capitalism is the problem, why do some capitalist states go to war and some capitalist states not go to war? Or if communism is the problem, why do some communist states go to war and some communist states not go to war? In other words, what we have is a puzzle here about how do we get explanations which really give us a good fit. Now, I don't mean to imply that the type of state doesn't matter. In fact, it is actually quite important. And I will come back to that and we'll talk about it some more. But the point is that very often we don't have enough of an explanation when we just know about individuals or types of states. And that's what brings us back to this third image, or the third level of analysis, which is explanations in terms of the international system as a whole. In that sense, what we'll find is that we often will use two types of explanation. We'll use a level 3 or systemic level of explanation, and we'll also use a domestic or level 2 type of explanation. What you could say is the system level of analysis is sort of from the outside looking in, and the level 2 or state type of analysis is from the inside the state looking out. And we often will need to know both of these. Well, if we need to know both, how do we know where to start in creating explanations? It seems to me that there's a long-standing practice known as Occam's razor, for the 14th century English philosopher William of Ockham, which says, start with what's simplest, or it's sometimes called the principle of parsimony in explanation. If you can get a simple explanation that covers a lot, then use it. If you find that it doesn't fit very well, then you have to add complexity. So in that sense, the system level of explanation tends to be the simplest. We usually will start then with system level of explanation, and then, as we need to, add more complexity by looking inside the states to get more of our answers. Now, when we talk about systems, there's still another wrinkle, if you want, or refinement that we want to make, and that's to say there are two features of international systems, two different aspects. There's a dimension we'll call structure of a system and a dimension we'll call process. Now, the structure of a system refers to the distribution of power in a system, and the process refers to the pattern of interactions among the states, the way the states relate to each other. Structure and process affect each other, but structure changes more slowly in process. Now, what's all this mean? It sounds very abstract, but let's try to illustrate it by going back to our economic example to pin down the concept of structure. Note that economists categorize the structure of markets by the concentration of the power of the sellers in the market. So we talk about a monopoly as a market where there's one seller, a duopoly where there are two sellers, an oligopoly where there are several sellers, and a perfect market has a wide number of sellers in the market. Now, we get different predictions depending on how we see that. And similarly, political scientists describe the structure of the international system in terms of the distribution of power among the major states. We could talk about a unipolar political system internationally where there's one preponderant power, a bipolar system where there are two major centers of power, multipolar where there are three or more, or a dispersed political system where there are a large number of powers, 10 or more. Now, in terms of our earlier economic example, we saw how a businessman who tries to maximize profits in a perfect market winds up benefiting the consumer. But such effects depend upon the structure of the system. If wheat farmers in a perfect market try to increase their earnings by producing more wheat, the supply of wheat increases, the price may fall, assuming that demand is constant, and the poor farmer's earnings may actually drop as he's tried to produce more because everybody else is producing more. However, if the market has a monopoly or oligopoly structure, if it's not a perfect market structure, then the big seller may increase their profits by restricting production in order to raise prices. In other words, knowing the structure of the system helps the economist to make predictions about behavior. And similarly, the political analyst uses the structure of the international system to predict certain types of behavior. In a multipolar or dispersed power system, the prediction is that there'll be development of alliances to balance power and flexible patterns of shifting alliances. There'll be wars, but they'll tend to be limited wars. In a bipolar system, the prediction tends to be that there'll be strong conflict along a central cleavage and a loss of flexibility. Some people even say that a bipolar system either erodes or explodes. Indeed, if you go all the way back to Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War, what Thucydides describes there is the way the Athenian alliance and the Spartan alliance became tighter, made a bipolarity among the Greek city-states, and that finally led to a war. And similarly, we'll see in 1914 the increasing rigidity of the two alliance systems leading to a system of almost bipolar relations, which then leads to war. But there's a problem for that simple prediction based on the structure of the system, an anomaly, if you want, which is that since 1945, the bipolar system in which the U.S. and the Soviet Union were the two great powers or superpowers, that system was relatively stable. And similarly, one would have said that after the 1960s, when the Chinese and the Soviets broke their alliance, that the Americans should have tried more balance of power politics with the Chinese, that it should have been more triangular. That did occur in the 1970s, but it took a decade to develop. So there's a bit of a puzzle as to why that took so long. So obviously need something else to explain exactly what happens in international politics besides just the structure of the international system. One of the other things we can do at the system level of explanation is turn to the second dimension of systems that I mentioned, which is the process, and see whether that helps us to get a better fit between the facts and what actually occurs. Now, I defined the process of international system as the pattern of interactions among the states, but perhaps it'd be easier to put it in a homely metaphor of a poker game. If you think about a poker game, you can quickly fix in your mind the difference between structure and process. Remember, structure is the distribution of power, so structure is like the pile of chips in front of each player. How much power do you have in terms of the money you'll throw into the pot? Process is how well you play the game. How do you hold your hand? How good are you at bluffing? How good at you are driving others out? Do you cheat on the rules or not? So essentially, structure is the distribution of power, process is the way you play the game and the rules of the game. Now, the process of an international system is determined partly by its structure. We argued that bipolar systems are less flexible, but it's also determined by incentives and capabilities for cooperation. those kinds of things that liberal theorists about international politics tend to put their emphasis on. For example, economic interdependence and institutions and other things that add a cooperative dimension to international politics. And the third thing, the extent of cooperation, is affected by the type of states in the system. What is the nature of their states in terms of the goals that they seek and the instruments they use? What are the ends and means that they seek? Let's look at each of those in turn. Let's look at the goals that states have, and let's look at the means or instruments that they use. Well, the process of an international system is affected by whether states' goals are revolutionary or moderate in terms of the rules of the system. Most systems have sort of basic rules or practices, and states may challenge or accept those rules or practices. So we may say that if you have a set of states which are relatively moderate in their approach to the status quo, then you may have a relatively stable international system. If you have a set of states which have goals of overturning the status quo, then you may have a more revolutionary international system in terms of its process. Let me give you some concrete examples. In the 18th century, the basic rule of the game was the legitimacy of the monarchical state. And the legitimacy of balance of power as a way to regulate the relations among states. So, for example, Frederick the Great of Prussia coveted the province of Silesia. Now, the trouble is the province of Silesia belonged to Austria, whose monarch was Maria Theresa. Now, Frederick went to war to take Silesia, and he went to war and took Silesia. But he didn't try to destroy Austria. He didn't try to unseat Maria Theresa. He didn't appeal for people to say, overthrow Maria Theresa. He said, all I want is Silesia. And he took Silesia. Now, notice how different that was from 40 years later when you have the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. They brought in a real change in the process of the international system. The French, after the Revolution, after they'd lopped the head off their monarch, wanted to get rid of all monarchs. They felt that French should sweep across Europe and bring the new view of republicanism to other countries as well. And Napoleon's armies eventually did this. So in that sense, you found an example of a war that occurred, the war between Prussia and Austria, within the traditional process of the 18th century system, which meant a change of one province, but not a change of the system as a whole. Whereas the war that occurred at the end of that century, in the beginning of the 19th century, the Napoleonic Wars following the French Revolution, were challenging the very process, the very rules, the legitimacy of the system itself. So that's a change in the process that comes in terms of the goals that are sought. What about the means? Well, the process can be strongly affected by the instruments that states use. The means may have a stabilizing or a destabilizing effect, and they may change because of technology, for example, new weaponry, or because of new forms of social organization. Let's take our 18th century example again. Let's go back to Frederick and the Prussian armies of the middle of the 18th century. Whatever Frederick's goals were, his means were limited. 18th century armies were mercenary armies. They had very limited loyalties. They were loyal as long as they were paid. Very limited logistics. Very hard to get the kind of massive campaigns that Napoleon later had. And they were called sometimes fair weather campaigners. Indeed, it was often said that wars were likely to break out in August because by then the grain was harvested, and that you had enough in the granaries and the treasuries to sustain a campaign, but a relatively brief one. Now, the French Revolution and Napoleon brought a totally different type of means. What you had is what the French called the levée en masse, the draft, as we would call it, in which you have citizens rallying to the motherland. They overwhelmed the traditional mercenary infantries that the monarchical states were using. And that, in turn, helped to change the process of the 19th century, or late 18th century, early 19th century international system. So such changes in goals and means can change the status quo system to a revolutionary or turbulent system. And states will behave differently under those two different types of process. And it's interesting to look at the Soviet Union and the post-war international system, post-World War II international system, as evolving from a period in the early part where you might still call it a revolutionary state, trying to overthrow the system as a whole, to gradually a much more status quo-oriented state. Now let's look at how these changes work themselves out over the process of the 19th century, because what we're going to do is interweave some of the history that we need for the onset of World War I in with the concepts that we need to understand it. The structural explanations, as I've argued earlier, are simpler than the process explanations. So by our rule of parsimony, if we can find an adequate structural explanation for change over the course of the 19th century, we ought to prefer it. And then as we find that it's not adequate, we add complexity of process to help get us a better fit. So how adequate are structural explanations for changes in the 19th century? Well, in terms of structure, we see Napoleon's efforts at hegemony destroying the process of the 18th century international political system, but not really altering the multipolarity of the structure. In other words, Napoleon and his wars changed the process, made it revolutionary rather than moderate, but because he didn't succeed, you still had left behind the different distribution of powers in a multipolar situation. The really key change in the structure of politics in the 19th century was the unification of Germany in 1870. And what the unification of Germany did was to change the distribution of power geographically right in the center of Europe. Basically, Germany, which before 1870 was more of an arena than an actor. It was a group of small states, one of which Prussia was larger than the rest, but not something that overwhelmed the other states of Europe. Germany, when it became unified, created a state which was right in the center of Europe, which was either too strong or too weak. In a sense, if it was strong enough to protect itself against both the Russians on one side and the French on the other side, it was also strong enough to scare either the French alone or the Russians alone. And a Germany which was not unified then was weak, it was divided, and a subject of intervention by others. So what you found as a key change in the structure of international politics in the 19th century was the unification of Germany, and that could be argued led to a growing rigidity of alliances until it became virtually bipolar and exploded in war in 1914. So that's how the structuralists would explain the changes in the 19th century and the onset of World War I. Now there's a strong core of truth in structural explanations of 19th century change, but it's not an adequate explanation by itself. For example, it doesn't tell us why Germany was unified. Why didn't Britain, which is a great power, prevent it? Or it doesn't explain why, if Germany became unified in 1870, why didn't this bipolarity, this rigidity of the two alliance systems, really begin to take shape until some 30 years later? It also seems overly deterministic. It removes too much the role of human choice. It seems to make World War I inevitable in 1870. But there might have been things that could have happened in this united Germany which could have made a difference. Suppose the Kaiser Wilhelm had not fired Bismarck, the skilled leader, the Iron Chancellor who brought about the unification of Germany. Or suppose that Bismarck's successors had kept what Bismarck thought was a key part of his diplomacy, which was an alliance with the Russians. Or suppose that Bismarck's successors hadn't challenged Great Britain by indulging in a naval arms race and looking for a naval challenge to Britain. Then it's possible that World War I might not have occurred. So essentially the better way to think of the structural explanation of World War I is that it's a partial explanation. It made World War I more probable rather than inevitable. So we want to then say that structural explanation has given us part of the answer of the onset, but not enough. So we're going to turn next to process and ask, what else do we learn about the changes over the course of the 19th century that grew from the changes in the process or pattern of relations among the states? Well, one is the change of the goals that states held over the course of the 19th century. The ideologies of democracy, which gradually grew over the course of the 19th century, the ideology of nationalism, that each state should be reflective of the national participation of its citizens, had strong effects on the goals that states pursued. It meant that the state and the ruler were no longer virtually the same. Louis XIV of France is famous for the quotation, "L'État, c'est moi." I'm the state. What's the difference? Well, as you get more democracy, as you get more groups playing a role, then there's a difference between the monarch and the country as a whole. You no longer can have such a simple set of decisions for when you go to war or don't go to war. You get an added complexity of domestic influences. In addition to that, Napoleon had greatly stimulated nationalism in Europe. When Napoleon's armies, his French armies, swept across Europe, they didn't change the structure of international politics in the sense of abolishing all these other states, but they had a profound effect on the process, as I've already argued. And in 1815, when the European monarchists tried to restore the world that they'd known before, under Austrian leadership of the Austrian Prince Metternich, they found that there was no longer the same flexibility. You no longer could be quite as immune to different nationalities, what languages people spoke, how they felt about this. And that meant that essentially the nationalism which grew over the course of the century meant there was somewhat less flexibility in the process. Nationalism also meant that the kinds of issues which later often contributed to or helped to contribute to World War I, issues such as Alsace-Lorraine, the province which Bismarck took from France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, became a very sore point, a sticking point, which it might not have, let's say, a half century or a century earlier. Now, the other change in the process of the 19th century international system was in the means, not just the goals. And the change in the means arose out of the application of industrial technology to military force, which produced massive yet inflexible instruments of war. For example, as we'll see as we get to the eve of August 1914, the fact that railways made it possible to mobilize large armies and ship them across continental reaches of space quickly was of tremendous importance. But it also meant that once you set in march the schedule for these railroads and the mobilization of these troops by railroads, it made it extremely difficult to stop, because if you stopped, all you'd have is a mass of disorganized men, not an army properly deployed according to a schedule. Another dimension in which industrial technology changed the means was the role of machine guns. Machine guns in trenches made a mockery of the idea of short, sharp, limited wars which would be over in a few weeks. So in a sense, then, we need to understand both the structure and the process explanations to explain adequately the end of the 19th century multipolar system and the origins of World War I. What we'll look at is structure first as the simpler, but the problem of, or the application of the process explanation reminds us not to be blind to social change. And we'll look at this again as we try to look at the changes in the balance of power on the eve and the workup toward World War I. But having said so much about the importance of Germany and the structure of international politics in the 19th century, let me add a footnote in conclusion of this lecture about systems about the question of Germany today. It's fascinating to see these questions that arose in 1870 and its aftermath reemerging as puzzles for our world today. The question, I guess you could say, that has been central to European politics since 1870 is how many Germanys are consistent with stability. After the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the answer was about 30. In the area that we call Germany today, there are about 30 states. And that seemed to be fairly stable until 1870. Bismarck, who is the genius behind the unification of Germany, was somebody who used German nationalism, but was not a German nationalist so much himself. He was interested in using nationalism to strengthen Prussia and Prussia's control of a larger Germany. So Bismarck's answer to the question of how many German-speaking states are consistent with stability was 2. Bismarck did not try to include all the German speakers inside the new German Empire. He deliberately left Austria out. And the reason was that the Austro-Hungarian Empire had many non-Germans, but in addition, it would mean that there was a rival throne for the domination of this new Germany, and he wanted his Prussian monarch to be the dominant figure in Germany. So that was known as the Kleine Deutschland solution, the little Germany instead of the large Germany. Hitler's answer to the question was, of course, 1, unite all the Germans. Bring in the Austrians, the Sudeten Germans from Czechoslovakia, one large German Reich. And, of course, that was a disaster. And in 1945, at the end of World War II, and in its aftermath, the answer that was given to this question of how many Germanys is consistent with stability was 2, or 3 if you want to include Austria. Indeed, there's a famous French joke that goes along with this, in which a French leader was asked, what is the right number of German states? And he said, I love Germany so much that the more Germanys, the happier I am. Now, with the decline of Soviet power in Eastern Europe, the issue has arisen again. And what we've seen is the answer of 1, but along with it, a number of anxieties. What will be the effect of having a large state of 80 million people in the center of Europe, which will be the largest economy in Europe, twice the size, nearly twice the size of France? If it's neutral, will it stay neutral? Well, one view is that this is fraught with dangers, that history will repeat itself, that we will see the same problems in the future that we saw after 1870. The other view, which stems more from the liberal tradition rather than the realist tradition, is that things have changed. But let's look at these changes in terms of the explanations at the system level that we've used. You could argue that structurally the situation has changed because of the role of the United States. The United States is 4 times the size of even a united Germany. To the extent that the United States remains in Germany, remains in Europe, then essentially this dominant role of Germany through its sheer size is diminished. So structurally, the U.S. role, to the extent that the U.S. remains a European power, is a major change. A second change is in the process of the international system. Unlike the earlier periods, the European states are tied together in ways that they weren't before. And that goes to the role of the European community. Germany today has as its tightest trading partners Britain and France and the Low Countries. The way Germany is integrated into the rest of Western Europe is extremely different from the Germany in which you had Bismarck's solid lump in the center of Europe looking both east and then west to find its own security. The Germany today has been tied, if you want, with many, many ties into the West. So there's a change in the process of international politics at the systemic level. And third, if we go beyond the systemic level and look inside the state, what we called Waltz's second image or second level of analysis, there's a big difference in the sense that the Germany today has had 40 years of democracy. Unlike the Weimar Republic, which failed in the 1930s, which had had a scant decade or so of democracy, the German state today, the largest part of it from West Germany, has been an effective democracy. And there are arguments that stem all the way back to Immanuel Kant that argue that democratic polities may be less prone to go to war, at least with other democratic polities. So you can ask this question for yourself, the question of how many Germanys is consistent with stability, and you can then ask yourself which of these types of explanations is the best predictor. If you are a structuralist, you will say, well, the structure is changed as long as the Americans are there, but if the Americans go home, am I back where things were before? If you believe that you should consider the process as well as the structure of the international system, you'll be a little bit more optimistic, and you'll say, this is a very different process in the Europe of today than in Europe of the past. And if you go beyond that to look at the second level of analysis inside the state, you'll say that the democratic nature of the polity in Germany, combined with the process, gives me a sense of optimism, that I don't think that we will see history repeating itself. But I'll leave it up to you as to which of these levels of explanation or types of explanation you find satisfying. What I've tried to illustrate for you is the way you can use a system level of explanation, both its structural aspects and its process aspects, and a second level or domestic level of explanation to try to get a handle on a question which has been central to stability in Europe for the whole period of over a century and a quarter, really, of how many Germanys are consistent with stability. And I hope that this use of the term system and the examples may give you a better feeling as to how you want to approach this question in the future.